The worst punishments in human history. Each punishment's worse than the last. Stick around if you dare. In 17th century England, being drunk in public wasn't just frowned upon. It came with a fashion statement you didn't want to wear. Meet the drunkard's cloak, a barrel, yes, a real wooden ale barrel, hollowed out and fitted over the offender's body like a humiliating tunic. Arms and legs stuck out through holes, turning the person into a walking, wobbling keg of shame. The weight made it difficult to move, and the absurdity made sure no one missed the point. Paraded through the village streets, the offender became a mobile warning against excessive drinking. Children would laugh, neighbors would gawk, and local officials might even throw in a few jeers of their own. It wasn't just punishment, it was a public spectacle. And this wasn't just some one-off gag. Towns across England and parts of Europe used similar barrel-based punishments to deal with habitual drunkards. In some cases, offenders were forced to clean streets or sweep public squares while wearing the barrel, adding a layer of exhausting labor to their shame. In an era before rehab or community service, the message was blunt and clear. If you couldn't hold your drink, you'd carry the burden. Literally. In 17th century Austria, justice sometimes came with a soundtrack, though not the kind you'd want to hear. Offenders accused of being disruptive, drunk, or just plain obnoxious could be sentenced to a peculiar form of public humiliation, the Shame Flute or Shame Flute. This bizarre contraption was a heavy metal collar shaped like a recorder, complete with finger holes and keys. It clamped tightly around the neck, and the victim's fingers were locked into place as if they were playing it. You couldn't sit. You couldn't lower your arms. You just stood in the town square, frozen in a grotesque parody of a musician, while passers-by pointed, laughed, and jeered. The punishment wasn't reserved for failed performers. It targeted gossips, loudmouths, and troublemakers, anyone deemed an irritant to the peace. In some cases, bells were added to the collar, ringing with every shameful step, to alert the entire town to your disgrace. A few shame flutes still survive in European museums today. Grim relics of a time when public ridicule was punishment enough, and silence was louder than any note ever played. You're stripped to the waist, weaponless, and shoved into a narrow corridor flanked by your own comrades. These aren't strangers. They're soldiers you fought beside, but now they're gripping clubs, belts, and fists, ready to beat you down. Then a command is barked, and you step forward. This is the Gauntlet, and there's no way out but through. Used by armies from 17th century Europe to colonial America, walking the Gauntlet was punishment for cowards, deserters, and anyone who broke military code. It wasn't just about pain, it was a public display of shame. The condemned had to walk between two rows of fellow soldiers ordered to strike, lash, and club them as they passed, and the line could stretch the length of a football field, or longer. There was no running, no dodging. You had to walk slowly and deliberately. Falling meant being yanked to your feet and forced onward. Collapsing halfway could mean dying where you fell. In some cases, a single pass through the line was enough, but for serious offenses, soldiers might be ordered to walk it again, and again, until they either dropped dead or reached the end. Survive it, and you were considered cleansed. Deep within the cold stone walls of the Inquisition's chambers, silence wasn't just expected, it was enforced. One of the most unnerving tools in their arsenal was a simple, brutal device known as the Heretic's fork. It looked harmless enough at first glance. A metal rod with two sets of sharp prongs, one end pressed beneath the chin, the other into the upper chest. But once strapped around the neck with a leather harness, it turned the victim's own body into a trap. Any attempt to nod, speak, or even lower the head from exhaustion drove the spikes deeper into flesh. This wasn't a method of execution. It was endurance torture, designed to wear the mind down through fear and fatigue. The victim couldn't scream, they couldn't whisper, they couldn't sleep. Every tremor of exhaustion became a stab wound waiting to happen. Worn for hours or even days, often in full public view, the Heretic's fork was both punishment and spectacle. It didn't need blood to break you, it used silence like a blade. In an age where questioning authority could mean death, this tool delivered a message loud and clear. Speak against the church, and you may never speak again. In the dark corners of medieval England and during the hysteria of colonial America, there was one punishment that spoke through silence: crushing. Known formally as peine forte et dure, this brutal method was reserved for those who refused to enter a plea in court. Under the law, silence meant no trial, so no guilty verdict, and therefore no seizure of property. But justice, as it was then understood, demanded a response. And the price for silence was pressure. The condemned were laid flat, a wooden board placed over their chest. One by one, stones were added. Breathing grew shallow. Ribs strained, then snapped. Blood vessels burst. There were no dramatic cries, only the quiet agony of a body collapsing under its own refusal to speak. The most infamous victim? Giles Corey. He was a stubborn 81-year-old farmer in Salem, Massachusetts, swept up in the 1692 witch trials. Accused of practicing witchcraft, Corey refused to enter any plea. Not guilty, not innocent. He didn't want the court to have authority over his fate, and more than that, he didn't want his land confiscated by the state. If he died without a conviction, his property could still go to his children. So they brought out the stones. Corey was stripped and laid in a pit, a wooden board placed across his chest. They began piling rocks, slowly, methodically. Over 2 days, the weight increased. His chest cracked. His tongue reportedly bulged grotesquely from his mouth. Each time the sheriff asked him to plead, Corey responded with the same defiant words. More weight. He never gave in. He died on September 19th, 1692, and to this day some say his ghost still roams near the site of his torment. In the dark corners of medieval dungeons and wartime prisons, there was a method of punishment so cruel, it turned the smallest, most unassuming creatures into tools of terror. Rats. The setup was brutally simple. The victim was bound, often shirtless, and a metal or clay pot was placed on their abdomen. Inside the pot, live rats. Then came the heat. Fire was applied to the outer end of the container, turning it into an unbearable oven. The rats, driven into a frenzy by the rising heat, had only one way to escape: downward. With nowhere else to go, they began clawing, biting, and burrowing through soft flesh, muscle, even organs if they had to. The victim could do nothing but scream as the rodents gnawed their way into the body. This wasn't some isolated legend. Versions of this torture were reported during the Dutch Revolt, in South American dictatorships, and even in some wartime Asian regimes. Vlad the Impaler was said to have used similar techniques, not to kill but to terrify. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. Rat torture wasn't about swift execution. It was about slow, creeping panic. In the sunlit courts of ancient Sicily, under the rule of tyrant Phalaris, a new form of punishment was forged, not just to execute, but to horrify. It came in the form of a gleaming, hollow statue, the Brazen Bull. Crafted entirely from bronze and shaped like a powerful bull, this device wasn't ceremonial. It was a death machine. The condemned would be locked inside its metallic belly, completely sealed off from the world, save for a small hatch beneath and a set of twisted bronze pipes placed in the bull's mouth like a twisted musical instrument. Once inside, a fire would be lit underneath, slowly turning the bull into an oven. The victim wouldn't die instantly. As the metal heated, their screams would echo through the pipes, transformed by the clever acoustics into what sounded eerily like the bellowing of a real bull. To spectators, it was a performance. According to legend, the man who invented the Brazen Bull, Bridles of Athens, proudly demonstrated it to Phalaris himself. But the tyrant, disturbed by its cruelty, or perhaps unwilling to leave such a tool in another man's hands, threw Bridles into his own creation to test it firsthand. The Brazen Bull became infamous not just for its violence but for its symbolism, a shining statue that hid unimaginable suffering within. Deep within the mighty Persian Empire, where absolute power ruled and betrayal meant ruin, there was one punishment so vile, so methodically cruel, that even time seemed to stretch around it: SCAPHISM. The condemned wasn't simply executed, they were entombed. Stripped naked and trapped between two hollowed-out boats or wooden shells, their body was sandwiched inside while their head, arms, and legs remained exposed to the sun and the swarming world around them. But the true horror began with kindness, if you can call it that. They were fed a steady diet of milk and honey until the body revolted, triggering uncontrollable diarrhea that festered between the planks. Honey was smeared generously on their face, hands, and feet to lure insects. And lure them it did. Flies, wasps, beetles, and eventually maggots arrived in waves, turning the body into a living hive. The sun beat down, the air grew thick, and as days passed, their flesh decayed slowly. Infection crept through every wound. Dehydration made them delirious. SCAPHISM wasn't common, but it didn't have to be. It was a punishment reserved for those who committed the most unforgivable acts, traitors to the throne,